March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea. The cockpit of the B-25 Mitchell is a screaming greenhouse of vibration and salt-streaked glass. To the left and right, the turquoise waters of the Pacific blur into a lethal gray smear just 50 feet below the bomb bay. There is no horizon, only the frantic, rhythmic pulsing of the Wright R-260 Cyclone engines. Captain Pappy Gunn grips the yoke, his eyes locked on the jagged silhouette of a Japanese destroyer slicing through the swells ahead. This is not the high-altitude, precision-calculated warfare the Army Air Corps taught in the deserts of Nevada. This is a street fight at 300 miles per hour. As the distance closes to 1,000 yards, Gunn's thumb hovers over the red trigger on the control column. With a single squeeze, the nose of the Mitchell does not merely fire, it erupts. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, packed into a solid strafer nose, ignite in a synchronized mechanical roar. The cockpit fills with the acrid metallic stench of cordite. Tracer rounds, stitched together in a solid white line of kinetic energy, tear into the destroyer's bridge, turning steel into confetti and seawater into a boiling mist of white foam. In this moment, the medium bomber has ceased to be a delivery vehicle for ordnance. It has become a flying battery, a predator designed for the sole purpose of total surface annihilation. To understand why American engineers eventually strapped an unthinkable 8 machine guns to a single airframe, one must first understand the catastrophic failure of standard doctrine in the early months of the Pacific War. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces arrived in the South Pacific Theater armed with a rigid, high-altitude bombing philosophy. The belief, cultivated at the Air Corps' tactical school, was that heavy and medium bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-25 Mitchell should operate at 20,000 feet, dropping sticks of bombs on stationary targets with pickle barrel accuracy. In the vast, shifting blue of the Pacific, this doctrine collided with a brutal reality. Japanese convoys were not stationary targets. They were fast, zigzagging destroyers and troop transports shielded by low-hanging tropical clouds and defended by the world's most maneuverable fighter, the A-6M-0. From 4 miles up, a B-17 dropping a bomb at a maneuvering ship had a hit probability of less than 1%. Pilots would return to bases in Port Moresby or Australia after grueling 10-hour missions, having expended tons of ordnance only to report that every single bomb had vanished into the ocean, hundreds of feet from their targets. The Japanese were successfully reinforcing their strongholds in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands with near impunity, moving men and materiel under a shield of misses. The frustration within the 5th Air Force was reaching a breaking point. General George Kenney, the aggressive commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, realized that if the Americans couldn't hit the ships from the clouds, they would have to come down to the waves. But low-level bombing was a suicide mission for a standard bomber. At 50 feet, a B-25 was an enormous, slow target for shipboard anti-aircraft fire. To survive at that altitude, the bomber needed to do more than just drop a bomb. The technical challenge of transforming a medium bomber into a flying gun platform was a nightmare of physics and weight distribution. A standard .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun weighs approximately 84 pounds, but that is only the beginning of the math. When you factor in the mounting brackets, the heavy-duty recoil dampeners, and the thousands of rounds of ammunition required to feed a multi-gun battery, the weight added to the nose of the B-25 was measured in tons, not pounds. Engineers had to solve the center of gravity problem. By stuffing the nose with lead and steel, the aircraft became dangerously nose-heavy, threatening to tip forward during taxiing or, worse, dive uncontrollably during low-level maneuvers. To compensate, armor plating was often stripped from the rear of the plane, and the heavy glass greenhouse was replaced with a lightweight but rigid metal cap. Then there was the violence of the firing itself. 8 or more heavy machine guns, firing simultaneously, produced a combined recoil force of several thousand pounds. This wasn't just a vibration. It was a physical blow to the airframe. Pilots reported that the cockpit would fill with so much smoke and gas from the burning propellant that they had to fly with the side windows open just to breathe. The muzzle flashes were so bright they could momentarily blind a pilot during dawn or dusk raids. To manage the ammunition, specialized chutes had to be designed that could feed belts at high speeds without jamming as the plane bucked and turned. Every square inch of the former bombardier's compartment was repurposed. What was once a place for maps and plexiglass became a dock. With the birth of the strafer, the very nature of aerial engagement in the Pacific underwent a seismic shift. No longer was the B-25 a passive observer of the skies. It became an apex predator of the littoral zones. The new tactic was a terrifying symphony of low-altitude maneuvers known as skip bombing. To execute this, pilots would descend until they were literally prop-washing the ocean, flying so low that the spray from the waves would coat their windshields. The machine guns were the key to the entire operation. As the B-25 roared toward a Japanese transport ship at 250 miles per hour, the pilot would open fire from nearly a mile away. The 8 to 12 forward-firing guns created a cone of death that raked the enemy decks. This wasn't intended to sink the ship, but to kill the anti-aircraft gunners and shred the delicate dual-purpose cannons before they could track the incoming plane. By the time the B-25 was within 300 feet of the hull, the enemy's defensive fire was usually silenced by a hail of .50 caliber rounds. At the critical moment, the pilot would release a 500-pound bomb equipped with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. Because of the shallow angle and high speed, the bomb wouldn't sink. It would skip across the water's surface like a flat stone. Slamming into the side of the ship just above or below the waterline, the B-25 would then pull up sharply, clearing the ship's masts by mere feet, just as the bomb detonated inside the vessel's hull. This tactic transformed the B-25 from a mediocre bomber into the most feared commerce destroyer in the American arsenal. It required nerves of steel. Pilots had to fly directly into the mouth of enemy fire, trusting that their own wall of lead would reach the target first. The tactical shift was a move from high-altitude safety to point-blank brutality. From the deck of a Japanese Akizuki-class destroyer or a Maru freighter, the arrival of a B-25 strafer was not an aerial bombardment. It was a psychological and physical hurricane. Most Japanese sailors were trained to watch the high heavens for the glittering silver specks of B-17s, giving them time to man their Type 96 25mm autocannons and calculate lead times. But the strafer defied the logic of the time. It appeared on the horizon as a dark, growing smudge, skimming so close to the water that it was often obscured by the crests of the waves. The terror began long before the bombs fell. At a distance of nearly 2,000 yards, the nose of the approaching aircraft would begin to sparkle with rhythmic, strobe-like flashes. Seconds later, a sound described by survivors as a continuous metallic tearing would reach the ship. The deck would suddenly erupt in a fountain of splinters, sparks, and blood. Because the .50 caliber rounds traveled faster than the sound of the aircraft's engines, the gunners were often being struck down before they even realized they were under attack. The sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. A single B-25G or H model, with its nose and cheek-mounted guns, could put nearly 100 rounds of heavy ammunition into the air every second. This wall of lead shredded the unshielded anti-aircraft mounts, detonated ready-use ammunition lockers, and turned the bridge into a slaughterhouse. Japanese accounts frequently mention the Demon B-25s, noting that the planes seemed to possess an unnatural level of aggression. By the time the aircraft roared over the deck, close enough for the sailors to smell the exhaust, the ship was often already a drifting, leaderless wreck. Its defenses pulverized by them. While the machine guns provided the volume of fire, American commanders soon hungered for a weapon that could sink a ship with a single blow. This led to one of the most audacious experiments in the history of aerial warfare: the integration of the 75mm M4 cannon into the nose of the B-25. This was not a specialized aircraft gun. It was a modified version of the heavy artillery piece found in the M4 Sherman tank. Fitting a tank gun into a medium bomber was an engineering feat that defied common sense. The gun alone was nearly 10 feet long and weighed over 900 pounds. Each shell was the size of a man's forearm. To accommodate the weapon, the nose of the B-25G and H models was shortened and reinforced with heavy steel plating. The recoil was so immense that when the pilot fired the cannon, the entire 15-ton aircraft would shudder violently, momentarily losing up to 20 miles per hour of airspeed. The gamble lay in the rate of fire. Unlike the machine guns, which could spray a target, the 75mm cannon had to be hand-loaded by the navigator in a cramped, vibrating tunnel. A skilled crew could perhaps fire one shell every few seconds. If the pilot missed, he was flying a massive, heavy-nosed plane directly into enemy fire with nothing but a few machine guns for protection. However, when the gamble paid off, the results were devastating. A 75mm armor-piercing shell could strike a Japanese destroyer from a mile away, punching through the hull and detonating in the engine room or ammunition magazine. During trials and early combat, B-25s were seen literally decapitating smaller vessels and blowing the tops off merchant ships. It was the ultimate sniper weapon of the skies, providing a heavy-handed complement to the shredding power of the machine gun battery. March 2, 1943, 10 a.m., the morning air over the Solomon Sea is thick with humidity and the smell of ozone. Allied reconnaissance planes have just spotted what the 5th Air Force has been waiting for, Operation 81. A massive Japanese reinforcement convoy, 8 troop transports screened by 8 destroyers, is steaming through the Vitesse Strait toward New Guinea. On board are nearly 7,000 soldiers, the last hope for the Japanese to hold their positions in the territory. General Kenny doesn't hesitate. He unleashes the full weight of the modified B-25 strafers of the 3rd Bomb Group and the 38th Bomb Group. As the American pilots approach, they see the convoy arranged in a defensive formation, a forest of masts and smoke on the horizon. The Japanese commanders, still expecting high-altitude attacks, have their heavy anti-aircraft guns angled toward the clouds. They are unprepared for what is coming at sea level. The Mitchells drop to the deck, their belly-mounted antennas nearly clipping the Whitecaps. The B-25s fan out, coming in from multiple angles to divide the ship's defensive fire. At 2,000 yards, the wall of lead begins. The 18-gun batteries erupt in unison. From the cockpits, the pilots see the Japanese ships disappear behind a curtain of fire and splashing lead. The .50 caliber rounds strike the water in front of the ships, ricocheting upward into the hulls and onto the crowded decks where Japanese soldiers stand ready to disembark. The sky is a chaotic tapestry of tracers and black bursts of flak. One B-25, led by Captain Murphy, zeroes in on the Kokosei Maru. He ignores the tracers streaking past his cockpit, his thumb locked on the trigger. The nose of his Mitchell is a continuous flame. The Japanese gunners on the transport are literally swept off their mounts before they can fire a single 25mm shell. With the deck suppressed, Murphy's skip bombs release. They dance across the water, 3 lethal skips, before slamming into the transport's waterline. The impact of the B-25 strafers during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just a tactical victory, it was a massacre. As the first wave of Mitchells pulled away, the Japanese convoy was left in a state of absolute terminal chaos. The Kokosei Maru sank within minutes, taking hundreds of soldiers and vital supplies to the bottom. But the slaughter was only beginning. Following the initial suppression, more waves of B-25s, coordinated with Australian Beaufighters and A-20 Havocs, swarmed the remaining ships. The 18-gun philosophy proved its worth in every engagement. By raking the decks of the destroyers, the B-25s ensured that the Japanese could not protect the slow-moving transports. The ocean was filled with the debris of a shattered army burning lifeboats, oil slicks, and the wreckage of a military strategy that had failed to account for the evolution of the medium bomber. By the evening of March 4th, the results were tallied. All 8 Japanese troop transports had been sent to the bottom of the sea. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers had followed them. Out of the 7,000 Japanese troops intended to reinforce New Guinea, nearly 3,000 were dead. The Japanese never again attempted to move large-scale reinforcements through the Bismarck Sea within range of Allied land-based air power. General MacArthur later described the victory as the decisive aerial engagement of the theater. The B-25 Strafer had effectively neutralized the Japanese Navy's ability to supply its forward bases. A modified medium bomber, born from field-expedient hacks and fueled by a desire for overwhelming firepower, had achieved in 3 days what months of high-altitude bombing had failed to do. The age of the flying battery had arrived, and it had rewritten the rules of naval warfare in the Pacific. The success at the Bismarck Sea sent a shockwave back to the United States. While Pappy guns' field modifications were brilliant, they were maintenance nightmares, often held together by reinforced steel plates and sheer willpower. Seeing the results, North American Aviation moved to formalize the flying battery concept on the assembly line. This led to the creation of the most heavily armed production variants of the war, the B-25G, H, and J. The B-25H was the pinnacle of this evolution. It arrived from the factory with the 75mm cannon and a staggering 14.50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in fuselage blisters, and 2 in a top turret. When field crews added more package guns to the sides, the count reached the legendary 18 machine guns. The plane was no longer a bomber that could strafe. It was a strafer that happened to carry bombs. These factory-built machines were more aerodynamic and structurally sound than the early Pappy gun specials. They featured heavier armor for the pilots, who were now essentially flying into the cone of fire of every target they engaged. The production of these variants signaled a total commitment to the doctrine of low-level destruction. The USAAF had officially abandoned the pickle barrel dream for the Pacific, replacing it with a weapon designed to saturate every square inch of an enemy's deck with fire. The strategic repercussions of the Strafer reached far beyond the immediate tactical victories in the South Pacific. By 1944, the B-25 Mitchell had effectively severed the Tokyo Express, the Japanese lifeline of reinforcement and supply. The sheer lethality of the 8-gun battery meant that no Japanese vessel, from a 10,000-ton transport to a wooden coastal lugger, was safe within 500 miles of an Allied airfield. This created a dead zone that forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to rely on submarines for supply runs, a desperate measure that could never move the volume of material needed to sustain an empire. The success of the B-25's transformation also sparked a fundamental change in aircraft design across the globe. American commanders realized that for close air support and anti-shipping roles, volume of fire was often more critical than bomb load. This led directly to the development of the A-26 Invader, a faster, sleeker attack aircraft that carried forward the lessons learned from Pappy guns' experiments. Furthermore, the psychological impact on Japanese morale cannot be overstated. Verifiable reports from the era describe a sense of helplessness among Japanese mariners. The sight of a B-25 skimming the waves became a symbol of inevitable destruction. By the time the war moved toward the Japanese home islands, the Mitchell had claimed hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, essentially starving out garrisoned islands before a single Allied soldier ever stepped foot on their beaches. The flying battery had not just won battles. It had helped win the war of attrition. The B-25 Mitchell Strafer stands as a testament to the raw power of wartime improvisation. It was an aircraft born of a mismatch between theory and reality, a bridge between the elegant, high-altitude dreams of pre-war planners and the gritty, visceral demands of the Pacific Front. By strapping 18 machine guns to a single airframe, the 5th Air Force didn't just modify a bomber. They redefined the philosophy of aerial combat. This evolution proved that in the chaos of war, the most effective weapon is often the one that adapts the fastest. The B-25 stopped being a precision instrument and became a blunt force tool of overwhelming fire. It was the ancestor of a doctrine we still see today. The idea that the best way to protect a pilot is to ensure that the enemy simply cannot look up. When we look at the modern A-10 Warthog with its massive GAU 8 rotary cannon, we see the direct lineage of Pappy guns' grease-stained hangars in Brisbane. The flying battery taught the world that the sky wasn't just a place to drop things from, it was a platform from which to dominate the surface. Ultimately, the story of the 18-gun B-25 is a story of human ingenuity. It is a reminder that when faced with impossible odds and failing doctrines, the solution isn't always a new invention. Sometimes the solution is simply more lead, more power, and the courage to fly low enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes.